So why don't U.S. banks and brokerage firms want to deal with non-U.S. residents? Well, there are really three issues that make it more difficult. In about 2010, FATCA came along, Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. And essentially what that means is through a carrot and stick method, U.S. banks and brokerage firms have to report on the holdings of Americans living overseas to the tax authority in that other country. And as well, you may notice, as an American living abroad, if you open an account in a foreign country, they will want to know that you're a U.S. citizen because they have to report to the U.S. Treasury Department on your holdings there. So it's a tax information sharing agreement. And also there are anti-money laundering laws and what are called know your client regulations. So all in all, it's become very complex for brokerage firms to deal with Americans living abroad. So what restrictions do brokerage firms put when a client moves overseas? What restrictions do they place on accounts? And what they might do is, first of all, they might ask you to just close the account. This is especially a problem if you have a U.S. retirement account because you can't just move that account overseas. It has to be a U.S. account. So you have to find another institution to deal with in the U.S. to hold your retirement account. But even if they don't ask you to close it, they may freeze the account. Fidelity is famous for doing this as an example. And freezing the account means that you can sell investments, but you can't buy new investments and you can't reinvest dividends typically. So can Americans abroad still access US-based financial advisors that are tied to brokerage accounts? Because it's not just a brokerage account. If you have a managed account, it's also a question, can you deal with the advisor? And what happens there is that for advisors, they have to deal with compliance departments, especially if they work for a larger firm, and their compliance department may not allow them to deal with Americans living abroad. And it also depends on the country. For example, Mexico doesn't seem to be a problem for many Americans living abroad or U.S. brokerage firms dealing with people in Mexico. But if you live in Europe, that's a whole different ballgame. And there are other countries that are especially problematic for U.S. brokerage firms, such as New Zealand or South Africa, for example. So it depends on the country. And sometimes the advisor may ask you to keep a U.S. address on the account, but you should understand what's going on there. Basically, what that advisor is trying to do is fool his compliance department into thinking you still live in the States. Not an ideal situation, obviously. So how does residency status affect trading rights in a U.S. brokerage account? One of the things that can happen is that you certainly won't be able to buy U.S. mutual funds if you don't have a U.S. address, because mutual funds are investment companies under the law. And as the phrase goes, they have to be registered where offered. If you're living outside the U.S., then they're being offered outside the U.S., and since U.S. mutual funds typically aren't registered anywhere but the U.S., you won't be able to buy them. And then you might run into other considerations as well. For example, U.S. exchange-traded funds. If you live in Europe, if you open an account with, say, Charles Schwab, which is a pretty good firm for dealing with U.S. expats, you'll find that you won't be able to buy U.S. exchange-traded funds. And you also can't buy the non-U.S. ones because those will create a U.S. tax reporting issue for you. But dealing through a U.S. advisor might get you around that. For example, we can buy U.S. exchange-traded funds in a Schwab account for our clients living in Europe. So you might have product limitations as well. And then, can Americans abroad open new brokerage accounts or only maintain existing ones? And policies on this vary. You really have to check with your brokerage firm, ideally before you move overseas, not once you're there already, because you want to know about this advance. So policies vary. So Charles Schwab, for example, and Interactive Brokers are two U.S. brokerage firms that are particularly good at dealing with expats. But even with Schwab, it depends on where you live. For example, in Spain, it's not a problem. And in most parts of the world, it's not a problem dealing with Charles Schwab. But in France, they will not open new accounts for people who have French addresses. But if you have a pre-existing relationship, let's say you lived in the US and you opened your Schwab account and then you moved to France, then it's not a problem changing your address to one in France. Italy is totally off limits for Schwab. There they won't allow you to keep your accounts, they won't allow you to open new accounts, nothing like that. But Interactive Brokers is actually really good at dealing with US expats. As an American living almost anywhere, except for weird places like Libya, for example, you will be able to open an Interactive Brokers account. And so the next question that comes up is, can I use a US address on my brokerage account even though I live overseas? And the fact is that a lot of Americans living overseas, to get around these regulations and around these problems with brokerage firms, do maintain a US address. Sometimes it's a relative, sometimes they own a property in the US still, sometimes they're using a mail forwarding address. But what you're actually doing is, it's not so much a problem for you personally, but it's a problem for the brokerage firm, because they have to do this FATCA reporting to the other tax authority. If they don't know you live overseas, they can't do that, and that might get them into deep water sometimes. That's also another issue for US expats, and it's really preferable not to use a US address if you're permanently living abroad. If you're just there for a couple of years, maybe it won't make such a difference. So which US brokerage firms allow expats to maintain accounts and which do not? It depends on the country. Interactive Brokers will let you open accounts almost anywhere, but they're not exactly user-friendly. Their software is built more for traders. I mean, if you're dealing with an investment manager that uses Interactive Brokers like we do, then you don't have to deal with them personally. We can deal with them on your behalf, but they are an option living almost anywhere. For Charles Schwab, it's country-specific. So in most parts of the world, they will allow Americans and even non-Americans to open US accounts, whether they're retirement accounts or individual or joint accounts. But if you live in Europe, it depends which country in Europe you live in. They do have some restrictions on European countries. And if you live in places like New Zealand or South Africa, or Italy in fact, or the Philippines, then Schwab will not allow you to open accounts at all. So Interactive Brokers and Schwab are good options. What reporting obligations apply to Americans abroad with US brokerage accounts? So first of all, if it's a US account, then the reporting obligations aren't that much different. So if you have an account with Schwab, it's going to be a US account, and you'll get 1099 forms. It's really not that much different from being a US resident. Now, with an Interactive Brokers account, it can be a bit different because, for example, if you live in Europe and you have an individual or joint account with Interactive Brokers, that is actually an account held at Ireland or possibly Luxembourg, and then it's not a US account anymore, it's a foreign account. And so that's the second question. If we're dealing with foreign accounts, where you've actually opened an account with an institution outside the US, then you may need to report that as a foreign account to the US tax authority. And the flip side of that is that you may need to report your US account to the local tax authority in your country of residency. Also, if it's a non-US account, then you will have what are called FBAR reporting considerations. And that's where you have to report your accounts, your foreign accounts, non-US accounts that hold over $10,000 in aggregate. So you can't open a bunch of accounts with like $9,999 in it. It's $10,000 in aggregate. That's the FBAR form. And then there's a second form which is related to FATCA called Form 8938, which is an IRS form. The FBAR is a Treasury Department form. 8938 applies to US persons and non-US persons that hold foreign accounts above a certain value. And generally it's 200,000 if you're single and 400,000 married. So it depends on the amount, and it also depends whether you're a US resident or not. Are dividends and capital gains in US brokerage accounts taxed differently for expats? So in many cases, if there's a tax treaty, you're going to be taxed locally on those rather than in the US. And then there might be a dividend rate that applies to those. Maybe it's 15% instead of 30% or something like that. There's also typically a difference between long-term, short-term capital gains taxation. In the US, we have a lower rate on long-term capital gains. That doesn't necessarily exist outside the US. Capital gains might be taxed in income. In rare events, capital gains might not be taxed at all. I think before 2000, South Africa, for example, didn't tax capital gains. So those are the kind of differences between dividends, capital gains, interest, and sometimes you also have a difference between the type of accounts. For example, in Spain, Savings accounts, joint and individual accounts, are taxed at a lower rate than, say, retirement accounts or other forms of income.